All right, let's do it again. Today's question, to sink or not to sink on bench press, obviously. So it's always, interesting to unpack this idea of what should you do? Should you touch lightly on the chest, a feather touch, pretend your chest is made out of glass and you don't want to break it? Or should you dump it and heave it? Sink right into the chest, use that body English, throw the bar back. What is better? What are the pros and cons? Which should you do? The thing you have to come back to anytime you want to discuss the nuance of technique or the differences in technique that you might see on the internet or in different lifters, different lifting styles. Remember, we all have a gold standard in our head that we're referring things to. So even if you are not a coach, you're just an average lifter, you're a lifter, a punter, maybe you're just a consumer of powerlifting. You're looking at a bench video on Instagram or a squat video and someone moves, they do their lift. You say, that looks really good or that looks really bad. You've got a benchmark in your head somewhere if you can make such a statement. And I can guarantee you can make that statement. Because if I show you something that's objectively really bad, just like without nitpicking biomechanics, you're going to say, oh, that doesn't look good. If I show you something that's really clean and smooth looking, you can say that looks really good. So we have a gold standard in our head that we are referring to. You may not be able to unpack that or understand it or vocalize it. That's totally fine. As a coach, you need to work towards being able to do that because that essentially informs your entire coaching philosophy. Everything you do is working towards that gold standard in your head, and a gold standard needs to have fixed parameters. There's very little room in a gold standard for variability. Like we are working towards something because when you start getting to those 1%, there has to be something to do, to work towards, to fix. Anyway, that's a whole different story. So we have to start with, well, what is ideal bench press technique? What does that actually mean? The way we break things down in ZeroW is in this concept of biomechanical rules. So you've probably heard me say this before if you listen to me talk anywhere. If you haven't, I'm going to say it again. You can't hear it enough times, which is like, even though you and I are built differently, even though we are, different shapes and sizes, sporting backgrounds, injury histories, whatever, we are the same animal doing the same movement. You have a shoulder, I have a shoulder. You have a hip, I have a hip. You're doing bench press, I'm doing bench press. Within these lifts, there are certain biomechanical rules that apply to everyone. Just like if you look at a physiotherapist, when you get injured, they don't have to take an exact model of your shoulder to show you what's wrong. No, they just pull out a human shoulder from under the desk and say, this is a shoulder. This is what you've done to it. This is how we're going to fix it. So we need to look at bench press in this sense. So what is global? What applies to everyone? The way we break it down at ZeroW, we use biomechanical rules. And rule number one is always, where does the power come from? In bench press, the power comes from primarily the pecs. Yeah, there's some triceps, there's some delts. Primarily the pecs is what's moving the bar from point A to point B. Think about leverage for a moment. Like the pec's job is to lever the arm across the body. Think about leverage. You grab a deadlift jack, you hook it under a deadlift bar loaded with 300 kilos. You can lift 300 kilos off the floor with one hand because of the mechanical advantage of leverage. That leverage only works because the leverage point is fixed. Where the handle meets the base is fixed. If that was broken, if that was made out of rubber or a spring, when you pull, nothing would happen or power would get lost in that slack. Come back to your body. The pec levers the arm across the body. That assumes that the leverage point, the shoulder, is fixed. But your shoulder is not fixed. You can move your shoulder. You can translocate the position of the shoulder joint. You can move it forward. You can move it back. You can move it up. You can move it down. It's one of the most versatile joints that we have. So we need to understand that we need to fix the shoulder in order to get the most out of the pecs. That's where this common rhetoric of like shoulders back and down comes from. So that's what I'm thinking of when I'm talking about the best technique for bench press. I'm thinking we're fixing the shoulder in place such that the muscles moving the weight from point A to B are not losing power via slack in the system. So should we sink or should we heave? Well, with that notion, the ideal approach to bench press would be to have a very light, soft touch on the chest. So the language I use is what I said before. Pretend your chest is made out of glass and you don't want to break it. Other people might say, you're not even going to touch your chest. You're just touching your shirt. You're touching super light. The idea with this is on the eccentric, we're building tension. When we touch the chest, we're maintaining that tension in the system, we're maintaining position, and we're holding that position such that the muscles that are now eccentrically loaded can do their job to push the thing back up. Just like in a squat, we control the weight down to the hole and we try to maintain that tightness so we have something to push from. Dumping and sinking into the chest would be the equivalent of gripping and ripping a deadlift, or the equivalent of dive bombing a squat. Ideally, we want to keep tension into the system or in the system for a number of reasons. A, it creates predictability and consistency. When you have a controlled approach, it's much easier to develop a framework or a system, a pattern in your body, a movement pattern, where you hit the same point on your chest every time. So you're consistent in that movement, where things are fixed in the same position every time, versus the volatility that almost always comes with the dumping and sinking method, where people who tend to sink into their chest, dump into their chest, as things get heavier, tend to dump a little bit lower and try and throw the bar back a little bit harder. And as a result, the position of the shoulder joint will change to accommodate where the bar is going. The body will do what the brain is telling it to do. So if you're telling it to touch a particular point, the body will move to accommodate that. So we ideally should be shooting for a soft touch, in my opinion. That would be the ideal scenario. That raises the question then, is sinking into the chest fundamentally bad? If you've followed me for a long time, you might notice that I sink into the chest occasionally. I have lifters that sink into the chest occasionally. So doesn't that contradict what I'm saying? Well, not necessarily. There are several other factors that we need to consider here. So if we're talking about powerlifting, which we are, because that's what I talk about. If we're talking about powerlifting, remember the goal is to move the most amount of weight possible. Sometimes there is a gap between the technical ideal and the way that you can move a weight at any point in time. Our goal with training is to close that gap and shift it in the other direction, where the technical ideal informs the top weight, but that's not always possible. And one of the most common circumstances where it's not possible, and lifters will have to resort to sinking and heaving, is lifters who are getting that hideous sort of nervy type of arm pain that comes from low bar squatting when you have poor control of the shoulders. So when you're doing heavy low bar squats and you have poor control of the shoulders, when you go to bench, you get this horrible arm pain. It presents in a couple of ways, normally in the bicep, sometimes on the inside of the elbow, sometimes in the top, down the forearm, and sort of up your brachioradialis area. That hideous bicep arm pain is a direct block to touching lightly. If you try and touch lightly when you have that pain going on, it's near impossible. And if you do, you lose so much ability to push because you're either neurally blocked for some reason, or the pain block is enough to not allow you to push. And so in those circumstances, you can get around it by just dumping into the chest and throwing it back. And so if we're coming into a competition and I have a lifter that's struggling to maintain that light, tight touch because of arm pain, and they fail a 210 kilo bench, but if they sink and heave it, they bench 220 and it's still within the rules of comp, we're going to go with the 220 because it's about lifting the most weight at that point in time and then building foundation outside of the competition in the long term to work towards that technical ideal. So essentially, it's not that one is necessarily better than the other. It's about choosing your weapon at any point in time. I kind of take that back. I mean, light touch is ultimately going to be better in the gold standard, but this is the art of training. This is the art of lifting. This is especially the art of coaching, is finding that balance between technical ideal and performance and working towards, again, closing that gap. So if you sink into the chest, there are a couple of things you can do to make this a little bit better. So one of the key issues with sinking that you're going to find is, again, going to be that unpredictability. I'll give you a couple of more examples just to, I guess, highlight or showcase how you can turn this into analogy if you're not quite getting what I'm saying. So dumping and heaving, I said the equivalent of like dive bombing a squat or gripping and ripping a deadlift. Another way to look at it is, what do you think would be easier to do? You go on to bench your max weight, you start at the top, you come down to the chest and you press it back up, versus you load your max weight on the safeties, you crawl under it, you get into position, you try and push it back up. Most people are going to say, in fact, all people should say, do it from the top down. So it's going to be really hard to push from nothing. When you dump into the chest, that's essentially what you're doing. You tend to let go of everything and then try and re-engage it as you throw it back. Ideally, you're going to keep everything engaged and on to, again, lean into that eccentric tension that you build on the way down. The lack of predictability that comes with dumping and heaving is going to influence position for sure. But another thing that comes with it is people, the more they dump and sink, tend to let go of their leg drive. When you let go of your leg drive, you really flatten out. When you let go of your leg drive and then you re-engage it to push up, there's a much higher risk that your butt comes off the bench. So people who dump and heave tend to get pinged for their butt coming off the bench in competition. So if you do get into the position where you have to dump and heave because of arm pain, because you haven't developed the control yet to touch lightly on the chest under a heavy weight, there are strategies you can use to make it better. One of the strategies is going to be, to the best of your ability, try and keep your leg drive on. Don't relax your entire body when you hit the chest. Instead, try and keep your legs engaged, keep your chest high. Try to the best of your ability to keep your upper back engaged. That's the other thing people do. They completely relax their upper back, shrug their shoulders up, all of that stuff that comes with it. A big part of that's going to be negative is when you do that, you relax your leg drive, you shrug your shoulders up, you completely flatten out. You essentially lengthen the range of motion. Not only is this no good in a competition setting, but if you're training and you're doing sets of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, every rep you do is going to be flatter. You're going to make it harder for yourself. You're going to be essentially in a deficit. It's not ideal. So if you can keep your leg drive on, if you can maintain as much tension as reasonable and still sink a little bit to alleviate the pain, or because you have that lack of control, you're going to have a much better experience with this style of bench press. It's really important if you do this to jam yourself in super tight into your arch with your legs, again, to prevent your butt from coming up, because that's where lifters who do this tend to miss out the most. Lifters who do this tend to get a lot of bar dip as well, so they throw it back and they kind of miss the line, so their shoulders don't necessarily catch it in a balance point. The bar drifts down and then they catch it and they push it back up. So lifters who tend to sink and heave tend to end up with downward motion of the bar calls on bench press as well. Again, we have to think bigger picture. It's not just about like, oh, what feels strongest for the lifter? It's also, what does this mean in the long term? How can we build upon this? What are the implications for this when we take a lifter to competition? There's more to think about than just it feels good or if it doesn't feel good. Anyway, I just wanted to give a quick overview of that. I think there's several examples of this that we can unpack, and I intend on doing that in future episodes. Things like sumo versus conventional, even wraps versus sleeves, wide stance versus not wide stance, heels versus no heels, close grip, wide grip. There's so much we can pick apart when it comes to technique stuff. I don't want to make it boring. I just want to make it relevant to you guys and the kind of questions you come up with. So keep asking me questions, get in my inbox, tell me what you want to hear me talk about, and we'll riff on it. Thank you.